Yo, what is up, guys? Snap here. Today we're going to be talking about the state of endgame juicing in the 325 Settlers of Calgary expansion. We just concluded our group play session, which lasted about 5 days, and we cut it off a few days early than what we normally go, just because simply we just weren't having fun in the new state of the endgame. So to people who are new around here, I do group play mostly at the start of the league. I just want to give a few disclaimers that a lot of this stuff is coming from the perspective of that and just, endgame juicing in general. So just be aware of kind of like what lens I'm looking at the game through. Another quick disclaimer is that solo players have a lot of endgame activities they can engage in because of loot tiles specifically, and this video is going to be mainly focused on the quality of like ground loot. There are a lot of issues that are plaguing the endgame right now. There's going to be timestamps if you want to go to a particular topic. Anyways, let's just jump right into it. The first big topic to address with endgame juicing is of course going to be the quant removal. Now, to be honest, this change was very unimpactful and is quite frankly a red herring. Because they left the glittering scarab in the game here, you're going to be getting just under the amount of quantity you were able to get on your character before. And because of the way diminishing returns works with quantity, you really aren't getting that many more items from having, let's say, 120% quantity on an old color character or an MF character versus the 100 you receive from the scarab. And in fact, this could be considered a buff from the baseline because you are getting that extra scarab slot, and because it gives you an additional 200 rarity, it should probably be seen as a strict buff to MFing and quant farming and that kind of thing, because you are able to obtain a higher amount of quant and rarity than you were before using the extra scarab slot. So when we're talking about the state of endgame juicing in the 325 expansion, it's important to know that the removal of quantity from gear is simply just not a factor in the discussion, which brings up my next point, and that is going to be you are simply just pigeonholed now into slotting a glittering scarab into your map device. It is now the only source of quantity that you have, so if you're doing any sort of ground loot juicing strategy, you just simply have to put glittering into your map because it is simply the biggest multiplier you could possibly add to your map, right? Going from 0 to 100% quantity is simply just a massive jump in ground loot, and there is simply no other scarab that competes with that slot, and it simply just becomes a mandatory scarab to put in the device, which doesn't feel great at all, does it? I don't know how you go about solving this sort of an issue or dynamic if you're GGG. Maybe their solution is to just remove it like they have a lot of other mechanics, but to be honest, that would just make ground loot feel even worse than it already is on the patch right now. So that's kind of the first problem I have with the endgame right now, is that you are just simply pigeonholed into putting glittering in your map, and it kind of limits your options a little bit. Next topic I want to talk about is going to be the balance of T17 and T16s and the binary on-off map mods that exist on T17 maps. So currently the dynamic is T16 maps don't drop very much loot in comparison to T17 maps. So if you are wanting to generate a ton of ground loot, you are kind of forced to go into T17 maps. This feels really horrible for a variety of reasons. One of them is that you cannot scry div cards onto your map if you're in a T17, and the T7 map div card drop pool is honestly really bad, so you're just kind of taking div cards out of the equation. And farming div cards in POE was honestly a lot of fun. Choosing a good tile set, getting a bunch of cards from it felt really good, and if you're doing T17s, that's just completely removed for the most part. Additionally, rolling T17 maps is just the absolute cancer that exists in this game. I cannot believe that this was not addressed coming from Necropolis, and they just simply left the rerolling of T17 map mods in the game. It is one of the most hated and unfun activities in the game. You have to reroll literal hundreds of chaos to get the desired mods with the desired rarity or whatever more currency roll that you want, and then you have to take a look at the map mods, which aren't really map mods. It essentially just reads, your build cannot do this map. And it's not even a consideration of whether or not my build can handle it. It's just something you just have to permanently avoid. The map mods on T17s are way too binary and way too build disabling. For example, one mod like less area of effect can go over 100%. So if your build has anything that has any area of effect, it no longer works. Stuff like that is just honestly laughable that it still exists in the mod pool. I'm sure there are tons of other examples in T17s. That's just one I want to bring up. Now, also related to that, you see people creating regexes that are multiple searches because it won't fit into a single search. It's honestly just like a clown show, like with the T17 map mods. It's just crazy to me. Honestly, coming from the 324 to the 325 patch, I was hoping we'd see some sort of rework to the rerolling of T17 mods. They said in the patch that they're going to be nerfing the values of the rewards of T17s, but they are still very, very rewarding. So you're still just going to be chaosing T17s hundreds of times at endgame to get the desired mods that you want. It's just a little less powerful this time around. And now you're running, honestly, just horrible layout maps with no div cards, which feels bad. And this is going to lead us to our next topic, which is going to be the divination card rework and also the nameless seer. I think the divination card rework here is probably one of the biggest failures of the patch personally. And honestly, it makes divination card farming as an endgame strat just completely dead in the water. There are a number of compounding factors that are contributing to this. The first one is going to be obviously with the change of the div cards from the pool, the maps that were good before are less powerful because of the removal of supplementary cards on the map. For example, if you were running Crimson Temple or Defiled Cathedral before, you were able to supplement your income of div cards with cards like the Innocent as well as 7 Years Bad Luck while you were farming for cards like Apothecary. If you look at the pools of popularly farmed cards before, there simply just isn't a very powerful supplemental card on any of these maps, which means that the value you can pull out of those maps is very diminished because you're just farming for one single card. The next thing that affected divination farming is of course going to be the removal of the divination scarab. We used to have the winged divination scarab, which gave us 3.5 times more divination cards. And if you wanted to specialize into just farming a good tile set with good div cards, you could of course just go hardcore into divination farming. The scarabs are now just completely removed, and the scarabs that they replace them with aren't really powerful for generating any amount of meaningful div cards here. And so you're never really going to be wasting your scarab slots putting div scarabs in these days. Now, there were some obvious abuse cases with the old divination scarab of plenty, which forced a div card drop and on very specific tile sets could produce a lot of, for example, barracks respites, or in the case of the massive exploit, a ton of divines. After they fixed that scarab, there really isn't a way to farm div cards anymore. You might be thinking they added a divination chisel, which gives you 100% more div cards, but in order to apply that chisel, you have to remove the regular quality on your map, which is providing item quantity. Item quantity is obviously very good, and it is a trade-off now that you're adding 100% more div cards to your map. And honestly, reducing the amount of other loot that you're getting in your map, frankly, just isn't worth it with a new div card pool. So before, we had wing scarabs that gave you a 250% more multiplier to div scarabs, or in the case of Necropolis, we had the crazy stacking of divination cards with curation, and then the replacement for that is just going to be simply the chisel, which you also have to give up quant for, even at a lower value than what any of the other scarabs provided. Just makes divination cards feel really worthless in the new patch. In relation to div cards, there's also the new scrying mechanic. As I mentioned earlier when I'm talking about T17s, you can't do these onto T17s because they aren't on the Atlas, which means that you have to give up those huge multipliers you get on the T17 maps in order to be able to scry a map, and that is at odds if you're trying to juice endgame loot. So it's another incentive to not farm div cards because the T17 mods are so powerful. All of those compounding factors together make divination card farming just essentially worthless, and it honestly is a huge fall from grace from all of the fun we had farming Necropolis curation. Div cards in PoE are such a cool mechanic, and they are a really fun thing to farm, but the nerf after nerf upon the removal of the scarab, the replacement of the chisel, the T17 mods being so good, you just don't farm divination cards anymore, and it is a huge shame because it really is a cool thing to engage with in PoE, and in my eyes, it's just a huge shame. Next thing I want to talk about are going to be the new chisels. I want to go through these one by one because some of them probably have some decent use cases, and some of them are honestly just completely worthless. First up is going to be the Maven's Chisel of Avarice, which is going to be the enhancing currency items. This chisel probably has some niche use cases for strategies that generate a lot of raw divines, think like Legion, that kind of thing, and it honestly is one of the more powerful chisels in the game right now. However, if you're in a group or anything like that, these kind of chisels don't scale at all, because a lot of those things that are generating those divines are loot tiles and therefore are not accessible to groups. But yeah, of the chisels that exist, the one that is enhancing currency is probably one of the better ones, alongside the scarab one as well. The scarab chisel is powerful for scarabs that are obviously target farming scarabs, and there are strategies that take a lot of scarab drop chance on the tree. This strategy is going to be enhanced by these chisels. It is actually pretty decent. I cannot say the same for the next three chisels here. As I mentioned before, the divination chisel is simply just a weaker version of what we had from the scarabs before. It rolls up to 100% more div cards, which is weaker than an old polished divination scarab. On top of that, you have to sacrifice the quantity on your map from the base quality to even put the increased divination cards on here. On top of all the other downsides, which I mentioned before, not being able to do T17s is a big one here. And so but this chisel honestly just isn't very powerful. Next chisel is going to be the Maven's Chisel of Procurement, which in my eyes is honestly the most useless chisel they've added to the game here. It is 60% additive item rarity to the base map rarity. It is not a more rarity multiplier, it is increased and additive with all of the rarity you already have on the map. Many 8 mod maps and especially T17 maps get a ton of increased item rarity already, and this is just additive 60%, not even 100% with the other rarity. And keep in mind, you have to sacrifice 20% map quantity to put this on, and is frankly just useless. You would absolutely never sacrifice the 20% quantity you get on the base chisel to put these item rarity chisels on your map. It is honestly just a laughable joke. And the last one, of course, is going to be the pack size. The pack size chisel does feel like it is adding a substantial amount of monsters to your map, but there is a big problem with this chisel in that with the removal of the divination and reliquary scarab, you don't have a huge multiplier that you once had before, and the quality of your loot is honestly a lot less. So while you can kill a bajillion mobs, they simply just don't drop very good loot. There are some strategies that generate a monstrous amount of ground loot and items. They aren't enough to be tiered up to good uniques, and you aren't dropping good div cards because you don't have the multiplier before that you had with the div scarab and the reliquary scarab. So adding pack size to your map is simply just going to maybe lag your map more without increasing the amount of loot that you're getting. And that was kind of our experience when we were using these chisels. You can kill a lot more mobs, but why would you do that? Because you're just simply sacrificing quantity on your map instead, and those mobs aren't really dropping much loot anyways. Yeah, that's enough about the chisels. The next thing I want to talk about is going to be the Affliction and Sentinel reintroduction. Now, first one is going to be obvious here, and that's going to be Affliction. It is just crazy how much they nerfed this mechanic, and I honestly don't know why they even decided to put this back into the game. It is an absolute joke the way that this mechanic has been reintroduced to the game. I'm sure a lot of the players that have run Affliction for themselves have gone into the map and gotten maybe even a 12k Affliction map, only to clear the rest of the map and wonder to themselves, what did that even do? It truly feels like it is maybe 1/10, maybe even 1/20th of what the mechanic was before, and it still has all the same difficulty with all the extra proj and the crit and stuff. And it really just makes you wonder why it's like this, because you simply are just going to skip it. It's not worth making your map so much more difficult for the marginally improved rewards here. Feel the same way about Sentinel. You don't have access to the passive tree, which made your Sentinels very good. For example, the blue Sentinel, which spawned a pack of mobs, that kind of thing. It also randomly rolls your Sentinel to just random stuff. I guess it's nice when you see it just because it is a low effort click mechanic, but it is also less powerful than it was before. And these two mechanics being introduced doesn't really help the state of juicing in the 325 expansion. Moving on to other nerfed mechanics, we're going to be talking about the ghosting nerf. There are a lot of mechanics that relied on ghosting, such as rogue exiles, getting guaranteed ghosts from the passive tree. There was also the old ghosting strats of old, including Tota card farming and that kind of thing. And this is simply just nerfed by a factor of 10. In the patch notes, these ghosts now give you something like 50% increased quantity for the touched mobs. Before, this number was in the 5, 6, 7, 800. So it's honestly like a 90-95% nerf to all of the mobs that are getting ghosted. They also removed the nodes on the wheel that were giving more quantity to possess monsters, further nerfing ghosts into the ground into irrelevancy, and also isn't contributing to the barren state of endgame juicing. Next thing to talk about is going to be the removal of the Reliq and div scarabs, and how I believe scarabs have been in a really terrible spot since Necropolis, but the issue was really just masked by All Flames. Bubgun was really talking about this last league in that the state of endgame is honestly not in a good spot since Necropolis. However, there were some really crazy mechanics that were involved with All Flames and like Shaper touched mobs and that kind of thing that were kind of propping up the endgame to feel a lot more juicy than it actually is. And now that we have a mechanic that doesn't really have an enticing in-map component that's adding a lot of loot, and the problematic stuff like Shaper touch was removed from the game, we are left with a really barren state of endgame, and honestly, it's just a poverty league all around. Now, I am of the opinion that Necropolis and Affliction Affliction loot levels were just way too high and obviously super unhealthy for the game. But we have rubber banded so far in the other direction, we're approaching like Calandra levels of loot. It honestly feels so terrible. The removal of Reliq and div scarabs was honestly super unnecessary in my opinion, and it makes the quality of your loot way worse on average. They had so many huge changes to the loot and the scarabs that were important for endgame juicing that all of the nerf after compounding nerf on juicing just left their game in such a bad state for juicing in the endgame. It's honestly sad. And I think there was a perception that the game state was a lot better than it actually was, just because there was Necropolis adding so much just chaos that it was hard to kind of wade through and tell how good the endgame would actually be if we didn't have such a juicy mechanic like Affliction or Necropolis adding so much to the endgame here. But from my perspective as a group player, I do think there needs to be another pass on the scarabs. I think there's just so many issues with the scarabs here in regards to vertical scaling and stuff going out of proportion that they feel like they need to nerf other areas of the game to compensate for the problems that are arising from the scarabs being vertically stacked. What I mean by vertical stacking of scarabs is something I mentioned in my Necropolis retrospective is you have huge investments into one category of mechanic because you can of course use multiple scarabs of one mechanic. But this leads to vertically integrated strategies that can honestly blow up and balloon out of proportion if one of the scarabs is very powerful. It also makes mechanics feel really bad if you aren't vertically stacking a bunch of scarabs. And if you're just running through your map and you see an abyss and you don't have 5 abyss scarabs on it, you're simply just going to skip it because the market is going to be dictated by people who are running these kind of mechanics with 5 scarabs stacked on top. And when you are running those 5 scarabs, the multiplier after multiplier after multiplier on that one mechanic is so out of proportion that for other players who aren't running those 5 things, it is no longer worth engaging with those mechanics at all. And so you just start to skip stuff, which I think leads to a really negative gameplay loop. So my opinion, my perspective, I think the scarabs are a huge issue. And I do think there needs to be a huge pass over the scarabs because to me, it just ain't it. One last thing I want to touch on here was this patch note that came out before the league release was the monster increase item rarity and quantity changes. The main patch note we're concerned about here is a major change we have made alongside the above is that we have changed a lot of the quantity and rarity bonuses on monsters to prevent things multiplying out of control at the very top end. There were cases that were utilized by fewer than 100 total players in the league and they were able to yield tens of thousands, in some case hundreds of thousands of unique items dropping in every map while not even playing in a party, and as such had monopoly on unique item market. So GGG has also gone through and changed a lot of monster IIQ rewards, and I think this is also contributing to the amount of loot that is dropping in the end game right now. There's some conspiracy here that the changes to this Mob IIQ is making a lot of the increased Mob IIQ things additive with each other and not multiplicative. So stuff like Delirium and the Delirium bonus and that kind of thing is like additive, but it's all just conjecture, conspiracy at this point. The one thing we do know for sure is that there's been a pass on monster IIQ and it's been lowered so that it's not multiplying out of control at the top end. And I think this is also one of the main things that's contributing on top of the scarab changes, on top of the chisel changes, on top of the ghosting nerfs, etc. All of that together is just leading to a really barren juicing meta and something that honestly just doesn't feel very good. But one of the main thing that confuses me is the fact that they felt this necessary to do a blanket nerf to Mob IIQ in the game when the two things that were contributing to the massive inflation of uniques was just due to the really overpowered league mechanics in the form of Affliction and Necropolis. If you take the Affliction league and you don't have that crazy multiplier from the league mechanic itself, and then conversely with Necropolis with the just huge all flames and shaper touch and back to basics abuse, which were all patched out, there isn't really a way for you to balloon loot out of proportion like they're claiming here. So it's just really odd to me that they did such a huge blanket nerf to Mob IIQ when none of those things that were causing issues are in the game anymore. Yeah, that's most of the topics I wanted to talk about in regards to endgame juicing in 325. It just feels really bad. Honestly, it's demotivating. We cut our group early, as I said before. I'm going to make a video going over all the builds and that kind of thing and how it performed and, you know, how much money we made, that kind of thing. So take a look out for that. It's a fun league regardless. It's always fun getting together with the boys. I just hope that we see some changes to juicing just because it really doesn't feel great. I really do hope that this gets some sort of address in the future. So once again, I'm Snap and thanks for watching.